believe my folks are on. All right. We are at the last presentation from the SaltStack booth for BlackHat. Well, for today. We have 4 more of these that I'm excited to give you tomorrow. And hopefully we've been able to share some information, some insight. Now, I want to talk about looking at cybersecurity from the inside out, from the operations perspective. So very often, what we do from a cybersecurity perspective is we take that outside-in scan viewpoint. Where can we get hit? What is exposed? Infrastructure has changed dramatically over the years, and so has cybersecurity's viewpoint of an infrastructure. We have needs around microsegmentation and firewalling that's different than it used to be. We have approaches to how to capture forensic data that's different. But as has been the theme of the day, at the end of the day, it's all about teams. It's all about people and what those people need to do to get their jobs done. And that's what cybersecurity from the inside out, I feel, is all about. When we look at a cybersecurity problem, oftentimes we don't conflate the set of issues that we're dealing with back to how those are managed on the operating systems and in the infrastructure that we need to interface with. When we look at it that way, the fabric of what's difficult and what's hairy from an infrastructure perspective starts to change. It also changes because we can look at the total liability of these vulnerabilities. The total liability of a vulnerability allows us to also assess what we should expect from its remediation. So how do we view security from the inside out? How do you look at things from a total liability perspective? So, what we want to do to assess things from a total liability perspective is to understand what the liability is that we impose or gain or lose from the remediation of the issue. Let me use network devices as an example. Many infrastructures, of course, have network devices. You can have network interfaces in the cloud, or an on-prem infrastructure can have network devices on-prem. So again, as an example, if there is a vulnerability inside of a network device, which there are many, then the liability of the network device being modified or being compromised can be very difficult to assess because we have sizable amounts of network traffic going through that device. We're not necessarily sure what services are going to go down and what information can be compromised because of the vulnerability of said device. That creates a double-edged sword. Well, we need to update the firmware in this device to remediate the vulnerability. But if that device does not properly come back online after that update, we don't have a clear view of what would be compromised. But if we don't resolve the vulnerability in that device, then we don't have a clear view of what an attacker could compromise. Which means that the severity of the situation becomes worse. What an attacker has access to has a significant bearing on the severity of the vulnerability. That access is often very difficult to assess from the outside in. We come back and using that network device as an example here. What we end up looking at is the realization that we have a vulnerable device, and because of the difficulty and the liability of updating it, oftentimes we go so far as to completely ignore what the compromised potential surface area of an attack could be. It would make more sense if we could gain these inside-out perspectives of what it is that could be compromised when we begin to look at and assess these problems. And so how do we do that? We come back to the teams, but also we come back to how we automate these problems. When we find a vulnerability, we need that vulnerability to be tied back to the services that it affects. Oftentimes we view a vulnerability only in its own right and in its own context. But it's much easier to come back and say, hey, this vulnerability is being expressed across a large set of ubiquitous infrastructure, a problem that I call the banana problem. We'll talk about that tomorrow. Or this vulnerability would have direct access to services that we otherwise wouldn't consider a problem in the scope of the fact that maybe that vulnerability is one that we don't think is as severe. But if that vulnerability were to be compromised, then the attacker would have elevated access. Looking at things from the inside out allows us to better harden our infrastructure against those vulnerabilities. It allows us also to assess the big picture. So let's come back to that big picture. If I have a vulnerability in a web application, then I know that that web application can be compromised. That web application then has access to my database. This is a very common path for compromising data or for planting ransomware inside of someone's infrastructure. You get the web app, compromise the web app, go after the database. Well, that web app in and of itself is also one of the surface areas that are most likely to become riddled with more vulnerabilities. This is because we're putting more and more software into those web apps. We have more and more third-party dependencies, and we're to the point where what's inside the web app itself can be as complicated as managing the security of an entire operating system was only 7 or 8 years ago. And so that complexity gets layered into the application, and I should emphasize, the security of the operating system has not gone away. Just because we focus on the DevSecOps pipeline doesn't mean that our overall security picture has fundamentally changed, or that there are problems that have magically gone away. So again, we come back to that big picture. How is it that we need to understand that as we are left on the pipeline, that these vulnerabilities need to be taken care of and tracked, but that they're not visible in production? And then we hit it from the inside and only discover them. By the time you discover that something is vulnerable from the outside, oftentimes it's too late. I'm astonished at how quickly many of these vulnerabilities are compromised in the wild far before a scan could ever be executed, because they're running the scans against your infrastructure. And the way in which those scans are run makes it significantly more difficult to detect. Again, it's not like the past. So, when we look at things from inside out, we're constantly looking at the systems that are running the code. And we're assessing the vulnerabilities and the configuration errors from the perspective of the infrastructure teams, which means that we next have a clear path to remediation. We have a clear path to really fixing those systems. Also, when we look from the inside out, we can take care of the problems that would be detected from the outside in, and we can take care of them faster. And again, the reason for that is that when we scan from the inside out, we are able to assess really what's going on the operating systems really what's going on inside of the applications. And we can tie those directly with automation to execute the repair. We cannot tie an outside-in scan directly to a repair because we don't know what's actually happening under the hood to be able to execute that. This is one of the major reasons why the cybersecurity industry struggles to get into the automation of repair. It is in large part because they don't even know what's going on that system level. This disconnect must be broken. And again, that is what we deliver at SaltStack. We come in and we are able to scan the systems and present the viewpoint that is important to the operations team and to the security team. That viewpoint is then directly coupled to automation. And that automation is just a click away from being able to fix it. But we're also able to take a look at the reliability. When you have a vulnerable system or component, you don't just care about the AI stream that's trying to assess how vulnerable any single vulnerability is, how dangerous that vulnerability is. You need to know how vulnerable you are to be able to make that assertion as to what it is that you're going to do and what it is that you're going to be taking care of. To make that assertion, you need to know exactly what it is that can be accessed through that vulnerability. You need to understand your internal web and your internal layout. That big picture can be incredibly difficult to ascertain because it's hard to be able to track, especially in these complicated, highly distributed containerized infrastructures and cloud infrastructures. What resource has access to another resource and to what level? And then hardening that access can be difficult, extremely difficult, because it makes it more difficult to develop the application when you have to be very careful about what that application has access to. So to create this overall scenario, we need to be able to look deep into the systems that we're securing. We need to be able to look deep into the systems that we are assessing. We need to be able to take information about the networks and take information about the dependent code, the code that we are working with that's deployed by the operating system and deployed by the app. We need to be able to understand what network traffic looks like and tie applications together. That view is, again, very difficult to get. But that big picture view is, in large part, what we at SaltStack are working to deliver. And we are able to deliver significant components of it today. Finally, when you look at it from the inside out, you shift the value and the liability and the responsibility and the accountability so that it is shared between the teams, so that it is easier to deliver to the operations teams the context that they need to be able to repair the issues that they are dealing with. And that context can be something which is a grounds of communication between your operations team and your security team. Because the security team should be aware of the context of the remediation as well. If the security team is aware of the context of the remediation, there'll be more understanding as to why it might take longer to repair those issues and why it is a complicated component. SaltStack strives to surface these issues. We want to be able to make sure that both of those teams are working with comparable data that allows them to communicate and, in the end, make good decisions and rapid decisions and good change and rapid change to their infrastructure. And therefore, we are able to see the fruits of their collaboration and really deliver a secure infrastructure. Instead of just chasing the next security gimmick, the next crazy security idea, I don't want to be one of the people hacking at the branches of the tree, but hacking at the roots. The root of these problems is communication. The root of these problems can be solved with the right type of automation, but only when it enables and empowers the people doing the work to get that work. Thank you for joining me for a day at BlackHat. Thank you for listening to these presentations, and thank you for engaging with our team at the conference today. They're here to answer your questions, and make sure that you take a look at the swag that we have available as well. I'll be back tomorrow with more presentations, and until then, make sure you enjoy this conference. Thanks.